Hi everyone, today we're going to take a look at a new lens from 7Artisans. It's their 27mm f2.8 APS-C lens for Sony E-mount cameras. So long story short, this is basically a prime lens for your Sony APS-C cameras. So cameras like the Sony a6700, 6600, the 6000, going all the way back to say even my Sony NEX6, which I have the lens mounted onto here. And of course you can shoot this on your Sony full frame cameras, but you'll probably want to shoot in APS-C crop mode because the image circle isn't quite big enough to cover the entire sensor. But some people actually like to use this creatively and take advantage of that heavy vignette and distortion and squeeze out maybe a little wider field of view as well as a few extra megapixels. So as I mentioned, this is a 27mm prime lens and it gives you a similar field of view to a 40mm full frame lens, and this seems to be a very popular focal length recently. And I think that's because it kind of splits the difference between two very popular focal lengths, right? The popular 35mm and 50mm on full frame, or if you're APS-C, that would be 23 and 33mm. And I guess that can make it more versatile for some, where if you want to get a little tighter and do portraits or fill the frame with your subject, you can. Or if you want to back up and get a little bit wider field of view and capture more of the environment, you can do that. Now this lens is an f2.8, which makes it relatively fast compared to say your kit lenses where you might be at f4 or f5, but compared to other primes, it's not as fast as say as an f1.8 or f1.4. So while you will lose some light gathering ability compared to some faster primes, you will definitely have a smaller, lighter setup that you can take with you and easily carry all day long. So let's take an overall look at this lens in terms of its build quality and design, and then we'll get into its performance with respect to autofocus and image quality. Now, like all the lenses I've gotten from 7Artisans, this has a very premium feel to it. It has a beautiful all-metal construction, including a full metal mount. There's a little USB-C plug here on the side for doing firmware upgrades, which is nice to have. But other than that, there's not really many features on this lens. It's not weather sealed. There's no function buttons. There's no aperture ring. However, there is a pretty nice focusing ring. Now, it's very well dampened and very smooth to turn. It's a little stiffer than I think some other lenses I've tried, but I actually prefer the stiffness of this one. It's not quite as stiff as, say, their 50mm that I tested recently, but it's not loosey-goosey either. So I kind of like that. It makes focusing very smooth, particularly if you want to do very smooth in focus to out of focus transitions manually. Now the lens only weighs 172 grams, which is on the lighter end of really any lens you can get for any system. But the dimensions are also very small, as you saw from the images. But to put it in perspective, it's very similar to size and weight to the Sony 24mm f2.8 G lens. And it's a little smaller than, say, the Sony 28mm f2 lens, both of which are full frame lenses, but they're also much more expensive. Now there's a plethora of third-party lens options for the Sony E-mount that are in similar focal lengths and apertures, but unfortunately I don't have any of those to compare to this lens. But I did do some pretty extensive testing on this lens, so let's get into what I found and what I think about the optical performance of this lens. Now looking at the optical design of this lens, it's relatively simple with just 6 elements and 5 groups. We also have just 6 diaphragm blades or aperture blades, and the minimum focusing distance is 0.3 meters, which actually gets you pretty close that you can take pictures of flowers and do some close-up photography, but it's not a macro lens by any means. Now when it comes to autofocus, like most lenses in this class, it uses stepping motors. However, when I had the camera in AFS mode or single point autofocus, and I was going from point A to point B, I found the lens to be extremely fast. I mean, it felt as fast as any lens I've ever used. And I didn't generate any false positives that I was aware of, whether it was here in the testing or when I was out in the field on my photo walks. So excellent performance here on the autofocus and single point. Now when I switched to continuous autofocus mode or AFC, the performance here was also very good. As you can see, going from point A to point B was very smooth and relatively quick. Not as fast as the AFS mode, but still very respectable. Now this is not a sports action lens. Obviously the focal length doesn't lend itself to that to begin with. But I did find the human and animal detect to work very well. As you can see in this video, as I'm walking forward and backwards, the lens was able to keep up with my face without any problems at all. Now the stepping motors did make a little bit of a whirring sound, so if you're recording video and using the internal mics, they will get picked up in the camera. It wasn't very loud, so if you're outside, you're not going to hear it, but if you're in a very quiet studio environment, you probably definitely want to use some external microphones. Now, when it comes to the overall optical quality of this lens, I found wide open we actually have pretty good detail and sharpness in the center, and then this falls off when we get to the edges, including some pretty heavy vignetting. But that said, stopping down to f4, the sharpness remains about the same across the frame like it was at 2.8, but we get a little better contrast. And this remains pretty consistent from f4 all the way up to f8. And then when we get to f11, we start to lose contrast and detail, and by f16, the lens gets pretty soft and low contrast due to diffraction, which happens really with any lens. Now, taking a broader look at vignetting, at f2.8 it is pretty prominent, and then stopping down to f4 gets rid of most of it, and then a little more by f5.6, and then finally by f8 is pretty much gone. Now, if you're shooting raw, I did notice the lens exhibited some barrel distortion that I had to correct for in post-processing. So you're looking at an unedited image here, and then this is the edited image with some minor barrel distortion correction along with the vignetting correction. Now, when it comes to chromatic aberrations like purple and green fringing, I didn't see it really in any of my images. Now I was able to force it in some of my testing, but again, just like the vignetting and barrel distortion, if you do see it in your raw images, it's very easily corrected. Now let's look at some of the more subjective optical qualities of this lens, like sun stars and bokeh quality, or the autofocus areas and speculars. Now, wide open at f2.8, you actually get a little smearing and coma in your speculars, so if you're going for sun stars, don't shoot at f2.8, but stopping down to f4 cleans up everything very nicely. You actually start to get some sun stars, and the streaks only get longer as you stop the lens down further. So here's a collage of f2.8 to f16. Now, when we look at the background blur here at the minimum focusing distance, everything is so blurry, it's really hard to tell anything from this. But if we shoot at a more reasonable distance of at least 1 meter, you can see that the background blur looks a little bit busy here. And I would say this is just average. And again, this is very subjective. Some people prefer this look. Some people would rather have it smoother. But to me, I would just call this kind of middle of the road. And then as we stop the lens down, of course, it gets less and less blurry. So here's a quick collage of all of them side by side. Now, when it comes to the bokeh or speculars, as you can see, when we get out to the corners, we start to get that cat's eye effect. And then in the center, we never even get really perfect round bokeh balls. We get more of a polygon shape, and that's due to the fact that we have a limited number of 6 aperture blades in the lens. And stopping down doesn't remedy this at all. They do get rounder, but they still have that polygon shape. So overall, I would rate the bokeh performance sort of average and to be expected with a budget lens. I would have preferred rounder bokeh balls, and you may have also noticed a very mild soap bubble effect in the bokeh, which is, caused most likely by the very simplified lens design of just the 6 elements and 5 groups. But take all of that with a grain of salt. Again, bokeh and background blur can be a very subjective subject. Now, one area where this lens struggles is in the ghosting and flaring. So if you take a picture directly into the sun, you're going to start to lose contrast. You're also probably going to get some flaring and ghosting. And this is a very common problem actually in most lenses until you start to spend a little more and get more premium glass. So I would call this, for a budget lens, kind of an average performance, but it is very prominent. So once I got familiar with the characteristics of this lens and the focal length, I took it out for a little photo walk, and here's a few images. So in this shot, I wanted to take advantage of the sunstar effect that this lens is good at, so I shot it at f8, then I used the shadows and architecture to lead the eye to that sunstar in the subject. And then in this shot, I wanted the exact opposite. I wanted a little bit of flaring off to the sun, so I stopped it back down to 2.8. And now I want to minimize the flare, but maybe get a sunstar effect, so I stopped at f8. And then for the rest of these shots, it was pretty much rinse and repeat, adjusting the aperture to what I thought would work best for the scene, taking advantage of the positive and negative characteristics of this lens. So this lens goes for $129, and I think at that price point, this makes an excellent choice for those of you on a budget and you want to upgrade from your kit lens and get your very first prime. So I hope you enjoyed this review and found it helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.